The rain poured mercilessly over the streets of Cedar Falls, a small town in the heart of the United States, where conservatism dictated the rules and appearances mattered more than any family bond. Emily Bennett, only 17 years old, stood in front of the house she had grown up in, rainwater running down her face as the weight of reality became unbearable. The door was shut behind her, locked. On the other side, her father's firm voice, Richard Bennett, echoed cold and sharp. "You have disgraced our family name, Emily. We raised you to be a decent girl, and look at what you've become." Her mother, Margaret, cried in silence but did not intervene. Emily already knew there would be no forgiveness. "You're leaving now," Richard said without hesitation. "Take your things and don't come back." Emily clutched her worn-out backpack, the only thing she managed to grab before being thrown out. Inside, a few crumpled bills, a change of clothes, and a wrinkled ultrasound image. The only concrete proof that a tiny innocent heart was beating inside her. The storm intensified. The freezing wind cut into her skin, but nothing hurt more than the betrayal of her own parents. "Please, Dad, I have nowhere to go," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "You made your choice," was all he said before turning off the house lights. Emily stood there for a few more seconds, hoping her mother would come back to open the door, that someone would call her back inside. Nothing. Only the sound of the rain and the cold night consuming her body. And then she left. The first night was a nightmare. Emily wandered the streets aimlessly, despair growing with every dark alley she passed. She tried to shelter at a bus stop, but the cutting wind and her soaked clothes left her trembling. Every passing car illuminated her pale face, but no one stopped. Her phone, dead, was useless. Her money almost non-existent. Her hope, fading with each minute. When the sun rose the next morning, she was already exhausted, starving, and completely alone. And so began her fight for survival. The cold wind howled as Emily walked through the streets of Cedar Falls, trying to find shelter. Her hometown, once familiar, now felt like hostile territory. Every narrow street and store facade seemed to scream that she no longer belonged there. Barefoot, with her soaked sneakers dangling from her fingers, she wandered the city in search of any place that could offer her a minimum of comfort. But the harsh reality of being a homeless, pregnant teenager struck cruelly. Emily knew she needed food and a place to sleep, but she didn't have enough money to rent a room or buy a decent meal. Her only option was to seek out a shelter. She remembered Hope's Refuge, a small support house in the city center, run by local church volunteers. Her heart pounded as she approached, knowing that many people there shared the same conservative mindset as her parents. But she had no choice. Upon entering, she was met by a middle-aged woman named Diane, whose expression softened when she saw Emily's soaked clothes and red eyes. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" Diane asked gently. Emily opened her mouth to answer, but only tears fell. Diane asked no further questions. She just held Emily's cold hands and led her inside. For the first few days, Emily barely slept. Her body ached with exhaustion, and fear of the future consumed her. But at least now she had a mattress to rest on and warm soup at night. It was there that she met Lisa, a 30-year-old woman who had also ended up at the shelter. Lisa had lost everything after her husband abandoned her with 2 small children. "I thought my life was over when I got here," Lisa confessed one night as Emily tried to hold back her tears. "But life goes on, Emily, and you're stronger than you think." Lisa was the first person in weeks to treat Emily with kindness. It was also at the shelter that Emily started to grasp the harsh reality of women like her. Many had been abandoned by their families. Others had escaped abusive relationships. Some had never even had a home to begin with. But Emily knew she couldn't stay there forever. The shelter provided a roof and food, but not a permanent solution. Besides, she soon realized that Diane and the other volunteers were subtly trying to convince her to put the baby up for adoption. "You're very young, dear. Maybe this would be the best for you and the child," Diane suggested one evening. Emily instinctively clutched her belly. She would not give up her baby. Determined to find a way to survive, she began searching for work. But who would hire a pregnant teenager with no experience and no permanent address? The answer came from an unexpected place. A small diner called Joe's Diner, where the owner, Joe Harrison, decided to give her a chance. "I can't pay much, but you can help with cleaning and washing dishes," he offered. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And so, Emily began her new life, balancing work, pregnancy, and the daily struggle to prove she could survive on her own. But life still had brutal challenges waiting for her. Days turned into weeks, and Emily started getting used to her new routine. The work at the diner was exhausting, especially as her pregnancy advanced, but at least she had a small income. Joe, the diner owner, showed genuine concern. "You shouldn't be on your feet for so long, kid. Want me to give you lighter shifts?" Emily always refused. She needed the money. Lisa, her friend from the shelter, helped however she could. Sometimes, she shared some of her food or lent Emily more comfortable clothes for her pregnancy. But despite her small progress, the world was not kind to a young single mother. Emily started noticing the way people looked at her when she walked around town. Discreet whispers, disapproving glances. Cedar Falls was a small town. Everyone knew her story. One night, while cleaning the diner's counter, a couple walked in and recognized her. "You're Emily Bennett, aren't you?" the woman asked with a venomous tone. Emily hesitated but nodded. "Shameful. Your parents were right to throw you out. Look at what you've become," the man sneered. Emily felt her face burn but said nothing. She had cried too much already. That night, she returned to the shelter feeling empty. Weeks passed and Emily started saving money. Her plan was to rent a small room before the baby was born. But then came the cruelest blow. One night, as she was walking back from work, she saw the shelter surrounded by police cars and firefighters. Thick smoke billowed into the night sky. People screamed, some carrying bags with their few belongings. Lisa was among the people who managed to escape, but some women were still trapped inside. Emily ran to help, but a firefighter stopped her. "It's too dangerous, miss." That night, 2 women died in the fire. The shelter was permanently closed. Emily lost the only place she had to sleep. Now homeless again, she was forced to sleep in the back of the diner. Joe let her stay for a few days, but she knew he couldn't house her forever. Lisa went to another shelter in a nearby town, and Emily felt more alone than ever. And then, something terrible happened. One dawn, as she lay curled up in the diner's storage room, a sharp pain shot through her stomach. Her water broke. The baby was coming, and she had nowhere to go. Emily gasped as another wave of pain shot through her body. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her. The diner was dark and empty. Everyone had already left for the night. She clenched her belly, her breathing ragged. "No, not now. Please, not now." She stumbled toward the back door and pounded on it desperately. No one answered. Her phone had been dead for days, and she had no one to call for help. Tears blurred her vision. Panic clawed at her chest. Just as another contraction hit, she heard hurried footsteps approaching. "Emily?" She turned her head and saw Joe, the diner owner. He had returned to pick up something he'd forgotten and now stood frozen in shock at the sight of her curled up on the floor. "My God, you're in labor." Emily could barely nod before another wave of pain consumed her. Joe didn't waste time. He grabbed his car keys and scooped Emily up as gently as he could, carrying her outside despite her protests. "Hold on, kid. You're not having this baby here." The ride to the hospital was a blur. Emily clutched the dashboard, biting her lip to keep from screaming as contractions racked her body. "You're gonna be okay. Just breathe. All right?" Joe kept glancing at her, worry etched deep in his face. By the time they arrived at Cedar Falls Medical Center, nurses rushed out with a wheelchair, and Emily was whisked away. "You're strong, kid. You got this." Joe gave her hand a firm squeeze before she was taken inside. Everything after that was pain and exhaustion. The doctor spoke, but she barely heard them. The contractions felt endless, a relentless fire tearing through her body. Then, after what felt like an eternity, a cry filled the room. Emily sobbed as the nurse gently placed a small, warm body on her chest. "It's a boy, Emily. You did it." She looked down at her son, red-faced, tiny, but perfect. A rush of love and fear overwhelmed her. She was a mother now, but as she cradled him, the nurse's voice cut through her moment of peace. "Emily, we need to talk about your options." Emily's heart pounded as she stared at the nurse. "My options? We know your situation. You don't have a home, you have no financial support. Adoption is a possibility. There are families who could give your son everything he needs." Emily held the baby closer. She had nothing. No job security, no place to stay, barely any savings. Could she really raise him alone? Her mind spun with doubts. But then she looked at her son's tiny fingers wrapped around hers, and something inside her solidified. She wouldn't give him up. "I'm keeping him." The nurse nodded, though Emily could tell she wasn't convinced. "If that's your choice, we'll connect you with social services to help." Emily barely had time to process those words when another nurse entered. "Emily, someone's here to see you." She frowned. "Who?" The nurse hesitated. "Your father." Emily's breath caught. "Richard Bennett." For a moment, she couldn't move. Memories of that night, the rain, the locked door, the cold rejection, came rushing back. "He asked to see you, but if you don't want to, we can tell him to leave." Emily looked at her sleeping son. Her past and present were colliding all at once. Did she want to face him? Her heart pounded as she whispered, "Let him in." The door opened slowly. Richard Bennett stepped inside, looking different than she remembered. The confident, authoritative man was gone. In his place stood someone thinner, older, and broken. His eyes landed on Emily, then on the baby in her arms. His jaw tightened. "Emily!" She didn't answer. For a moment, the room was filled with silence. Then, finally, Richard spoke. "I was wrong." Emily scoffed, shaking her head. "That's it? You were wrong?" Richard exhaled sharply, as if he had rehearsed a speech but forgot all the words. "I let my pride, my beliefs, cloud my judgment. I was afraid of what people would think. I thought I was protecting our family's reputation, but His voice broke. "I abandoned my daughter." Emily felt her chest tighten. "You threw me out. In the rain. Alone. And you never came looking for me." Richard swallowed hard. "I did look. But by the time I tried, you were already gone. And then, when I heard about the fire at the shelter, I thought—" He closed his eyes briefly, his hands trembling. "I thought I lost you forever." Emily studied him carefully. This wasn't the cold, distant father she knew. This was a man who had been haunted by his choices. "I can't undo what I did, Emily, but I can try to make things right." She hesitated. "And what does that mean?" Richard's voice was steady. "I want to help you. You and my grandson. If you'll let me." Emily's hands tightened around the baby's blanket. Could she trust him? Did he really change? The days that followed were overwhelming. Richard stayed at the hospital, visiting every day, bringing small gifts, diapers, baby clothes, anything he thought Emily might need. Margaret, Emily's mother, had passed away in the car accident, and Richard had been left alone. His grief was evident, but his focus was on making amends. Joe also came by frequently, offering Emily a place to stay temporarily. "My sister has an empty room in her house. You could stay there until you get back on your feet." Emily felt torn. She had spent so long fighting on her own, depending on no one. Accepting help, especially from her father, felt impossible. But then she looked at her son. She wasn't just making choices for herself anymore. And so, for the first time in years, she took a leap of faith. Emily moved in with Joe's sister, started working part-time at the diner again, and, slowly, began allowing Richard to be a grandfather. Trust didn't come easily. There were days when she still resented him. Days when old wounds felt fresh. But Richard was patient. He showed up. He apologized, again and again, not just with words but with actions. And little by little, Emily began to heal. She was still young, still figuring things out. But as she watched her son take his first steps, surrounded by people who truly cared, she realized something. She had survived. She had fought against the storm, and she had won. As Emily pushed Noah's stroller through the park one afternoon, she paused to look at the sky. The air was crisp, the sun warm. She thought back to the girl she once was. The girl standing in the rain, cast out, lost and afraid. And she whispered to herself, "I made it," because she had. The years passed like the changing seasons, each one bringing its own challenges, but also its own victories. Emily had learned to balance work, motherhood, and personal growth. She completed a vocational course in hospitality, thanks to a local scholarship program, and eventually earned a stable position at a hotel in Cedar Falls. Joe's diner remained a second home, and Joe himself had become like family. A mentor, a friend, and, in many ways, a father figure. Noah, now a bright and curious little boy, was the center of her world. He had his mother's determination and his grandfather's sharp eyes, though Emily prayed he wouldn't inherit the same pride that had once driven a wedge through their family. As for Richard, their relationship had evolved into something neither of them had expected. The first few years were tense. Emily kept her distance, allowing only limited visits with Noah. She didn't want to make the same mistake of trusting blindly, not after what she had endured. But Richard was persistent, showing up every week, never pushing too hard, always respecting her boundaries. When Noah was 4, he asked a simple but powerful question. "Mommy, why doesn't Grandpa live with us?" Emily had no easy answer. That night, she called Richard. "Would you like to have lunch with us on Sunday?" It was the first time she had invited him into her home. She wasn't ready to forgive everything overnight, but she had learned that holding on to resentment only hurt her more than it hurt him. Little by little, they found their way back to each other. Not as father and daughter, not yet, but as two people who had both made mistakes and were trying, in their own ways, to be better. One evening, after putting Noah to bed, Emily sat by the window of her small apartment, reflecting on how much had changed. The girl who had once been abandoned in the rain was no longer helpless. She had built a life for herself. She had given her son stability, love, and a future. And for the first time in a long time, she was genuinely happy. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, she found Lisa standing there, holding a suitcase. Emily gasped, then pulled her into a tight embrace. Lisa, the woman who had once helped her survive the shelter, had finally returned to Cedar Falls after finding stability in another city. They stayed up late, catching up on lost time. Lisa had found work, secured a small home for herself and her children, and, just like Emily, had fought to rebuild her life. "I always knew you'd make it," Lisa said, smiling. Emily smiled back. "And I knew you would too." In that moment, she realized something. Family wasn't just the people you were born to. It was the people who stood by you, through the storms, through the hardships, through the rebuilding. Joe, Lisa, Richard, even in his flawed way, were all part of her story. And as she looked around at the life she had built, she felt nothing but gratitude. She had survived. She had healed. And now she was thriving. The storm of the past no longer defined her. She had become the sun that followed it. The end.